Good morning. My name is Nicholas Marcus Thompson, and I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Black Class Action Secretariat, which leads the Coalition Against Workplace Discrimination. The Coalition members includes the Public Service Alliance of Canada, the National Union of Public and General Employees, the Canadian Black Nurses Alliance, the Ashanti Network, the Red Coalition, the Federation of Black Canadians, the 613-819 Black Hub, the Black Canadian Civil Society Coalition, and the Canadian Association of Professional Employees. I am joined here today by coalition members from the Public Service Alliance of Canada, represented by its National President, Sharon D'Souza, also from the Canadian Association of Professional Employees, Nathan Pryor, and we're pleased to have the support of the Canadian Labour Congress, which represents 3.4 million workers, here represented by its Executive Vice President, Larry Rousseau. On June 7th, the Coalition received, under the Access to Information Act, an internal audit on discrimination at the Privy Council Office. The Privy Council Office serves as the Secretary to the Prime Minister of Canada and the Federal Cabinet. It also leads the Federal Public Service of Canada. And the federal government is Canada's largest employer, and it relies on the Privy Council Office to manage its 137 departments, agencies, and organizations. As such, the Privy Council Office has a responsibility to be transparent and accountable to the millions of Canadians that it serves. This is why we felt it prudent to bring to you the findings of this 20-page internal report and its more than 30 recommendations, which until today have not been publicly available. In June last year, following 6 months of interviews with employees at the Privy Council Office, this internal review revealed a workplace where racialized stereotyping, microaggressions, and verbal violence was regularly practiced and normalized, including at the executive level. Staff also reported a culture that discouraged reporting and where accountability mechanisms were non-existent. It also identified that white employees collectively working at the PCO for longer periods of time and were clustered in permanent high-level positions compared to Black, Indigenous, and racialized employees who were clustered in low-level temporary positions. White employees and executives also detailed career advancing opportunities that were in stark contrast to those of Black, Indigenous, and racialized. And despite a call to action from the clerk himself for the public service to take specific and meaningful actions to address racism, equity, and inclusion, the report identified the PCO's own corporate services as a key barrier to that call to action. These are just some of the findings detailed in this report, which we've made available to the media and the public. It concludes with more than 30 recommendations. After we obtained this report last month, which we've had significant challenges in obtaining the report, the PCO has not followed the Access to Information Act when it came to providing this report. And we have we've sought a response from the PCO on the steps that they've taken since this report has been issued. And we welcome the creation of an anti-racism secretariat, an ombudsman, among other tools to tackle the issue of discrimination. However, these appointments and initiatives show some attempt to address the serious issues raised in the report, but ultimately, they still lack the depth required to fully tackle the systemic issues identified. And there are still many key recommendations that have not been addressed. And we are particularly concerned about the lack of accountability measures against leaders who were at the helm, while widespread discrimination was a regular occurrence at the Privy Council office. The office has also failed to implement equitable hiring practices recommended in the report, such as name blind screening, third-party hiring, and a rotating diverse hiring committee. And the data provided is meaningless when it does not include context. For example, reporting a doubling of diverse staff means nothing if the headcount simply went from 1 to 2, or if it does not identify whether they are permanent high-level executives versus temporary entry-level. As the report identified, was often the case for Black and racialized employees. Ultimately, we are witnessing a scenario where those who have been perpetrators of harm are now tasked with carrying out the solutions. And we have seen time and again that this simply does not work. The public service has historically proven to be incapable of policing itself on systemic discrimination. And it is clear that if we want to see meaningful and systemic change, we need separate arm's-length mechanism to hold the public service accountable and ensure that there are recourse mechanisms and restitution for those who have been harmed. I will now invite our partners to speak about some of the measures that we're calling for, including accountability and systemic changes, not only at the PCO, but throughout the federal public service. I will now invite Sharon D'Souza, National President of the Public Service Alliance of Canada.
Thank you, Nicholas, for your powerful words today, and I thank you and the Black Class Action Secretariat for your tremendous work, for shining a light on the racism and discrimination so many public service workers face. Dr. Rachel Zeller's report only saw the light of day through an access to information request. This is a failure of accountability, a failure of transparency, a failure of Canada's public service leadership. The report is shocking, but not surprising. It exposes a tragic, ongoing failure to take on systemic racism. The latest piece of evidence documenting a distressing trend, just like what we saw at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, just like we hear from our members in departments across the public service. Eliminating racism, discrimination, and all barriers our members face is at the center of the work that we do at the Public Service Alliance of Canada. I'm proud to be here today and continue this work. Dr. Zellers confirms that we've heard from our members for so many years. A tale of two separate and unequal realities. Yes, Black, Indigenous, and racialized employees experience a very, very different public service, without the same opportunities for career advancement, trapped in a revolving door of tokenism, brought into temporary positions to give the appearance of racial equity, then moving out without meaningful opportunities for advancement. Facing workplaces where microaggressions, put-downs, and indignities are a daily reality. Unacceptable. Dr. Zellers also spoke about the commitment, intelligence, and work ethics of the public service workers. This came as no surprise to me. I see the tremendous skills and dedication of our members every day. This is why the mistreatment of Black, Indigenous, and racialized workers is so maddening. So many with so much to offer systemically denied equal treatment and denied equal opportunities for advancement. Look, This is about the Privy Council Office, the highest office responsible for combating discrimination. But as Dr. Zellers makes clear, instead of fighting racism in the public service, the Privy Council Office is allowing it to fester. Instead, living up to their promise to foster diversity and inclusion, Black and racialized employees are actively discouraged from doing anything about it. They were even told that speaking up about racism distracts from their real jobs. Disgusting. Let me be absolutely clear. Standing up against racism and discrimination is our shared responsibility. It is all of our real jobs. We're not here today asking for reassurances. The last thing we need is more pretty words. No, the time for lip service is over. We demand urgent, concrete action. This means implementing Dr. Zeller's recommendations, appointing a Black Equity Commissioner, adding Black people as an employment equity group, as the government promised to do, and finally, settling the Black class action and Indigenous lawsuits. It's simply unacceptable. A government that claims they want to fight systemic racism is taking Black federal public service workers to court over that exact problem. This must stop now. On Thursday, we mark Emancipation Day, a time to reflect on the legacies of slavery in Canada, celebrate the strength of Black and Indigenous communities, and come together to demand justice. We invite everyone to join us on Thursday at 11:45 a.m. at the Human Rights Monument in Ottawa. We will march to demand action because only together can we finally end racism and discrimination in all its appalling forms. Thank you. I'll now turn it over to Nathan Pryor, President of the Canadian Association of Professional Employees.
Thank you, Sharon. Hi, I'm Nathan Pryor. I'm the President of the Canadian Association of Professional Employees. And CAPE is proud to stand here as a coalition partner in the Coalition Against Workplace Discrimination. So, as representatives of professionals working in the Privy Council office, we're outraged that such discriminatory practices have been allowed to persist. It's clear that significant structural changes are urgently needed to create a fair and inclusive workplace for all employees. The federal government must act decisively to implement all the necessary reforms that Sharon just mentioned and ensure accountability at all levels, not just at the Privy Council office, but across the federal government, as our coalition partners here have alluded to. So on top of what Sharon just mentioned, we are calling at the Privy Council office for the resignation of Deputy Clerk Nathalie Drouin, who has been responsible for the discrimination file since 2021, and the resignation of Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Ministerial Services and Corporate Affairs, Matthew Shea, who's the head of Corporate Services since 2017. These are the results of the public service policing itself on discrimination. We will not stay quiet in the face of blatant and systemic discrimination, and we won't accept half measures and well-meaning promises as the change that is needed. Enough is enough, and we'll see you at the Human Rights Monument for Emancipation Day in Ottawa at 11:45 on Thursday. Now, I'll introduce Larry Russo, the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress, to say a few words. Larry.
Thank you, Nate. Bonjour tout le monde. As you've heard, the Prime Minister appoints the clerk of the Privy Council. Under the clerk's leadership, PCO recommends who will lead the public service and therefore indirectly how it will be led and managed. Since the days of Arnold Heaney, the first clerk under Prime Minister Mackenzie King, the PCO has always been the model on which the entire public service is molded. Le rapport Zellers découvre ce qui se passe au sein du Conseil du privé, le contenu du rapport pourrait facilement s'appliquer à la plupart des ministères et agences du gouvernement fédéral. À titre de fonctionnaires noirs et gays, je crois que la plupart des employés noirs et de couleur et autochtones, ainsi que les employés faisant partie des autres groupes d'équité, seront nullement étonnés par les conclusions ainsi que les recommandations du rapport. Nous savons très bien que nous avons la diversité au sein de la fonction publique fédérale. C'est l'inclusion de tous les groupes qui nous fait dire que le leadership de la fonction publique échappe la balle, et ce, sur une base continue. L'état d'inclusion au sein d'une organisation est le reflet même de la culture qui y existe, la culture fondamentale au sein du conseil privé, ainsi que dans toute la fonction publique, est de maintenir la stabilité et le statu quo malgré les tempêtes politiques qui la touchent. And we understand the fundamental role of the public service. Nevertheless, we can easily point to a relatively successful model for cultural change in the federal public service, one I can speak to personally because it is where I spent most of my years in public service, and that is the Official Languages Bilingualism Program. I have personally dealt with the intolerance expressed by Anglophones having to make space for Francophones through the first equity program introduced in the federal public service in the 1970s. I started in 1981. The Employment Equity Task Force recommendations clearly speak to going beyond the numbers game, where we check off boxes. Inclusion starts first and foremost with leadership. Therefore, we ask the federal government to table, as soon as the House resumes sitting in September, the new Employment Equity Act legislation that is in keeping with the Employment Task Force recommendations. And we ask federal public service leadership, starting with the clerk, to effect true organizational cultural change within their respective organizations to respect differences in lived experiences of all employees, acceptance and valorization in the workplace of how we can put diversity to work for improving and making our workplaces more productive and satisfying for all employees. Finally, instead of fighting attempts to make employees whole for past injustices in the workplace that are now more generally being recognized, we once again call upon the federal government to settle this black class action suit and prove to all employees who are members of minority and equity-seeking groups that the leadership of the public service truly takes inclusion of all groups seriously through actions that are long overdue and not just empty words and promises to do better. I will reiterate the call of Sharon D'Souza and all the coalition partners to be there on Emancipation Day, August 1st. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This concludes the press conference, the points that we have and the call to action, the very clear calls to action. And we now open it up for any questions.
Is there anything in this report that really shocked you, or is this more or less what you've been seeing and hearing with the stories that you've been encountering in the public service? Is there anything that shocked you in this report?
Well, I think it doesn't go, you can't go lower than the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And we've seen the rampant discrimination at the Canadian Human Rights Commission. So when we received this report, it was shocking because it's still, this is the head of the public service. This is the the Privy Council office that directed the entire federal public service to address racism. So the very head of the public service giving directions on addressing racism is a perpetrator themselves. So how can the public service genuinely implement this call to action on anti-racism, which has been largely a failure? Some areas have not implemented since 2021 a single measure to address specifically anti-black discrimination. So while it is shocking, it is what we've seen across the public service, across all departments and agencies.
So you would say what's different here is that it's the organization, it's the department that the fact that this exists there is the most shocking part.
Correct. This is the highest level of decision making in this country. And we are deeply concerned with this organization's ability to address discrimination within its own ranks and throughout the federal public service.
Mr. Thompson or Mr. Pryor, you're naming names. You called out Natalie Duran, you called out Matthew Shea. Can you connect the dots? Why are you naming names? Are these two individuals that you are saying is responsible for a lot of the culture, a culture that perhaps is covering up or telling the employees not to be as concerned about discrimination and to focus on other work? Is this what you're saying by calling them out?
Sure. So the coalition felt that it was necessary as part of this process to ensure accountability. What we have seen in this report is a lack of accountability. The Privy Council Office did not make this report public. That was issued over a year ago. More importantly, the report identifies corporate services as a significant barrier towards addressing discrimination, to allowing when complaints would come forward. The report talks very clearly about corporate services being very problematic. So how can the same leaders who have presided over this harm be now responsible for the solutions? Everyday workers, they violate the code of conduct. They're held to a strict account. They're held to that order. So why should it be any different for leaders? And also, it sends a strong message of zero tolerance towards racism and discrimination in the public service. It tells public service leaders that if you allow the status quo, if you are in a leadership position and you allow the status quo and you allow discrimination to go unchecked, that you will be held accountable. And that's why the accountability measures are critical.
There are processes within the federal government for grieving. In terms of these cases, these individuals who have come forward, the black employees, the racialized employees, did they follow the process, the grievance process, and were they frustrated, and is that why they left? Or is this just part of their interviews as part of this internal audit?
The report highlights a culture that is very concerning. We have vulnerable workers who, in a workplace where retaliation, this is the head of the public service. Your career is shaped in this area. So making a complaint or coming forward is discouraged in this workplace. The report talks about that. So we have a lot of vulnerable workers who are already facing systemic barriers, trying to advance their careers. And this safe space was the only way for them to come forward and to share their lived experiences. So when we talk about processes, the report talks very clearly that this is not an area that encouraged or supported that. Because why? Because it distracted from the real job, right? Talking about discrimination and racism at PCO distracted workers from doing the real job. And this is a similar culture that we saw with the previous Governor General, that type of workplace that's very toxic. So I think based on the experiences that we've heard from, the stories that we've heard from workers, they're petrified at the Privy Council office. To come forward and make a formal complaint and then your career dies, they're petrified.
dites que les employés vivent de la discrimination, ont moins d'opportunités d'avancement au sein de leur carrière. Pouvez-vous nous donner des exemples concrets pour qu'on comprenne bien ce qu'ils vivent?
Oui, oui. Ben, j'en ai parlé dans mes remarques. Écoutez, ce que les employés vivent, c'est conflictuel. Parce que quand on se joint à la fonction publique fédérale, on veut faire une contribution de toutes nos capacités, de tout ce qu'on est capable de donner. Et lorsqu'on se heurte au mur de l'intolérance, on a parlé de microagression. Combien de gens savent qu'est-ce que c'est une microagression? Mais quand on est le cible, quand on les reçoit, jour après jour après jour, hein, ça a un impact sur notre état de santé psychologique et mental, d'abord et ensuite physique. Quand on est rendu au bout, mon expérience personnelle, ayant été dans l'Alliance de la fonction publique, comme vous le savez, mon expérience personnelle était que les gens qui se plaignent, et j'en ai traité des griefs dans le bureau du conseil privé quand j'étais là, malheureusement, ça faisait 1 an, 2 ans, 3 ans que les gens subissaient cet harcèlement, cette discrimination, et rendus au bout de leur rouleau, souvent en congé de maladie, qui ne voyaient pas d'autre choix que de présenter le grief. Et chaque fois que je m'assoyais avec les gestionnaires, je disais, il est trop tard. Le mal est fait pour cet employé-là. C'est ça qu'on vit. C'est ça que les gens de couleur, les gens qui sont autochtones, les gens qui ont des handicaps en milieu de travail, sans parler du groupe LGBT, et les employés noirs surtout, c'est ce qu'on vit.
Je sais que vous en avez parlé beaucoup en anglais. Est-ce que c'est plus, vous parlez plus d'un problème systémique?
Absolument.
Ou c'est plus des gestionnaires visés? Pouvez-vous nous en parler en français?
Vous savez, quand on parle de barrières systémiques, même quand on dit aux gens, ben vous avez le recours à votre syndicat, et que, en arrière, tout le monde sait que, je vais vous donner l'exemple frappant, les gens ne voulaient pas me rencontrer comme agent syndical en milieu de travail. Je veux pas que mon patron me voie avec vous, M. Rousseau. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Ça veut dire que la personne avait peur pour sa carrière. Et ça, c'est une barrière juste là. Et c'est systémique parce qu'il n'y a pas un ministère, il n'y a pas une agence dans la fonction publique fédérale, et j'en ai représenté plusieurs. Où est-ce que ce n'est pas le cas? Où est-ce que quand on voit, quand le superviseur, quand la personne qui est en train d'harceler est mis au courant, est allé voir le syndicat, c'est fini. C'est fini après. Et on est tanné. On est vraiment rudement tanné de cet état de choses-là.
Est-ce qu'il y a des choses dans le rapport, M. Rousseau, qui vous ont surpris, qui vous ont choqué?
Pas du tout.
Vous attendiez?
Je sais que c'est choquant. C'est le choc. Parce que oui, tout le monde, le bureau du conseil privé, quand on arrive au bureau du conseil privé, ben, on est arrivé. On est arrivé. Il y a peut-être 2 ou 3 autres ministères. Affaires globales, Finances, Conseil du Trésor. Hein? Ou est-ce que là, c'est le sommet, c'est le summum de la fonction publique. Mais quand on arrive au bureau du conseil privé, on sait que c'est dur. On sait que c'est difficile de gérer les problèmes politiques de tous les jours. Et les problèmes interpersonnels, mais ça commence avec le leadership. Et je l'ai vu, moi. J'ai vu des chefs, des sous-ministres responsables de départements qui ont pris le taureau par les cornes et on avait des résultats concrets. Malheureusement, c'est trop peu de gens qui l'ont fait. Et là, assez, c'est assez. C'est ça qu'on est en train de dire.
Si je peux juste ajouter à ça. Comme Larry a dit, c'est un grand problème systémique, c'est un grand problème structurel. Et ce qu'on demande, c'est une demande qu'on a fait depuis au moins 2 années. C'est pour un commissaire d'équité noire, comme on a fait avec l'antisémitisme, comme on a fait avec l'islamophobie. On a besoin d'une tiers partie de régler des problèmes de discrimination au sein des lieux de travail dans la fonction publique fédérale. On parle de la commissaire des droits humains canadien. On parle aussi du conseil privé. On est ici à le niveau le plus élevé dans la fonction publique et au bureau qui est tâché avec régler des problèmes de discrimination et l'abus des droits humains. On peut dire à ce point qu'on a des problèmes à travers la fonction publique. Si on parle de ces 2 bureaux ayant des problèmes de même, on a des grands problèmes de discrimination qui ont besoin d'une tiers partie. On ne peut pas demander aux gestionnaires qui ont perpétré le racisme et la discrimination, comme tout en détail dans ce rapport, pour régler ces problèmes. C'est une demande facile, c'est une demande systémique qu'on peut ajouter à ça. Donc, juste pour ajouter à ça, il y a des manières de résoudre ce problème qui sont très, très claires à nous autres et qui sont des demandes raisonnables et faisables dans les prochaines années. Donc, on demande pour l'action tout de suite sur ça.
Question about context. Can you give me a sense of how many employees are specifically in the PCO and what is the breakdown racially?
So the data for that, the report cites a lack of that type of breakdown in data. What we do know is that approximately about 60 workers participated in this review, including Indigenous, Black and racialized, as well as white employees also participated in this safe space internal review.
The PCO has about 1,200 employees.
And the PCO has about 1,200 employees.
We often, when we talk about government, we don't make the distinction between elected officials and like the public servants who last much longer than elected officials. Where do you see the greatest resistance for change here? Is it within ministerial offices, or do you think it's within public service officials? Because like most of your comments have not been about why is Freeland or Trudeau not doing this or that.
Well, we think there's some will of the politicians to act. The bureaucracy is, we believe, a strong part of the problem, particularly in leadership. A lot of the bureaucracy are doing check boxes right now, check boxes to say that they're doing something about the discrimination within the public service. But the public service, the bureaucracy largely does not want to address anti-Black discrimination. They don't think that it is a problem. I'll give you an example of that. The clerk issued the call to action in 2021. And within the first year or 2 years, the public service would have provided their responses to appointing, promoting, supporting Black, Indigenous, and racialized workers. And when you look at the response of the public service, the different departments, the responses clearly speaks to their intention. The responses were such as, we held a Black History Month event, we are listening, we are learning. What those responses did not indicate was, we've sponsored 10 Black employees to leadership positions. We have promoted this amount of employees. The tangible stuff is what has been lacking. And we've seen throughout the pandemic, when the public service and the government leadership, the elected leadership, when there's a will to act, how bureaucracy was removed and things were administered in record time to deliver services that Canadians relied on. So on the discrimination file, don't tell me that it's going to take a lot of time, or if there is a will, the government can address the discriminatory practices in the government and to stop the harm that is happening to workers. So the public service, the leadership of the public service, which is not representative of the Canadians largely that we serve, that is a big part of the problem.
Dans le rapport, il est question à quelques endroits de la dualité linguistique, puis certains employés qui semblent voir le manque d'accès à des cours de français, par exemple, comme étant une barrière. Vous avez fait un petit peu allusion tantôt à ça. Pouvez-vous clarifier un peu vos propos et vous parliez de reconnaître les différents types de diversité? Dites-vous que le français doit être écarté, qu'on doit mettre l'accent sur d'autres langues? Juste clarifier vos propos un petit peu parce qu'on a entendu ça par le passé de différents groupes.
I will respond first to David's question, but then it also applies to your question. Because when I was responsible for, when I had, as a program officer, responsibility within my department to implement bilingualism, it meant sitting down with managers and looking at all of the ranks within every division. How are you going to get this overrepresentation of francophones in the lower ranks of your division up into the upper ranks? And that meant going to directors general and to assistant deputy ministers and having the same exercise. We don't do that with employment equity. We don't have the same central agency oversight that we had back in the 1980s and 90s. We got rid of that. We decentralized from Treasury Board and the Public Service Commission the accountability measures that kept every EX person accountable for achieving the goals of the bilingualism program. In the 90s, we moved to decentralization, which means that every single department under the deputy minister who heads that department has their own plan, their own way of trying to achieve employment equity. That is a huge systemic issue because the accountability is only within that department or that agency. And then you have to have a report for the PCO, or you have to have a report for the Canadian Human Rights Commission. But are we going to have a report for everyone? There will be similarities across the reports because accountability, as Mr. Thompson said, is the bottom line. If you are not accountable and truly accountable as a senior manager within the department, well then, it's a numbers game. We're just checking off the boxes. Est-ce que c'est correct en français? J'ai répondu à la question.
Je peux vous y répondre en français aussi, juste
Oui,
pour
c'est
clarifier,
ça.
parce qu'il
Alors,
y avait deux aspects linguistiques. Il y a l'exemple.
Oui,
de la
alors
linguistique.
dans le programme de bilinguisme où j'avais une responsabilité comme agent de programme d'appliquer la loi, d'appliquer les politiques et les directives, là où j'avais une responsabilité de le faire, j'étais appuyé par la Commission de la fonction publique, j'étais appuyé par le Conseil du Trésor, qui avait un regard direct sur ce que les ministères faisaient pour assurer que les francophones étaient bien représentés, pas aux niveaux inférieurs. En 81, quand j'ai commencé, c'était largement ça. Mais pour monter les francophones à tous les niveaux, dans toute la hiérarchie organisationnelle. Alors ça a fonctionné et ça a bien fonctionné. Mais pour le programme d'équité en matière d'emploi, c'est volontaire. Il n'y a rien qui empêche, et dans les années 90, on a commencé la décentralisation et aussi l'impartition des pouvoirs au ministère directement. Alors, ce sont les sous-ministres de chaque agence et ministère qui ont la responsabilité. C'est inégal. Il n'y a pas une application égale de la loi en matière d'équité emploi. Et c'est pour ça qu'il faut regarder les recommandations du Task Force. Okay, du groupe de travail sur l'équité en matière d'emploi, et ils ont de solides recommandations pour ramener l'imputabilité et la responsabilité.
Mr. Souza, is there a gender breakdown? Specifically, did this internal audit show anything in terms of whether or not women of color would face additional barriers?
So right now I can say that report doesn't have a gender breakdown. And keep in mind, I just want to point out, there's only 60 participants out of 1,200. So what's the barrier there? And the lack of stats and data, there's a problem. So realistically, when we're looking at the Employment Equity Act and such, it has to be data-based for one. So if the Privy Council hasn't been looking at that data, why not? So, and of course we know, and this is not a report that you need. Like, honestly, do you really need another report to tell you that people with intersectional identities face more barriers? Of course they do. You don't need another report to do that. However, the question comes down to is why is there no data? Why is there data lacking? Right now, you can only file a complaint for staffing under not being assessed on your language of choice and abuse of authority. Where's the bias mechanism in there to file a complaint? So when we're looking at all of this, we have to look at the mechanisms, the gatekeepers, we have to look at the systems in self that are in place. It cannot just be one aspect of it and say, here's a priority, off you go and report back. There's no teeth. That's why the reform of the Employment Equity Act is so important. And that's why I truly believe it's time for the government to get off their butts and start making real reform happen. Thank you.
Sorry, final question for me. What is your interpretation of that data, that only less than 60 people participated in this safe space study? Does that mean that most were scared, or that there were only a few affected? What does that mean? Or very few individuals, BIPOC, who are in the Privy Council? What is your interpretation of that low number?
Well, it's interesting because Dr. Zeller's report is very clear. It's very, very clear in terms of how they were dissuaded from speaking up or speaking out. So as far as I'm concerned, when you're dealing with microaggressions, you're dealing with the workplace where you're dealing with put-downs and indignities on a daily basis, it impacts your mental health. So of course people are scared. Of course people are scared to speak out and participating in a report. And I just want to point out, this report was done in secret, and then it was contained. If you did not have the actual access to information, have that ability to receive it in that manner, we wouldn't have known about it. So when you're dealing with all these levels of secrecies, how can you expect people to stand up and speak out without expecting some kind of repercussions?
All right, so I know we're a bit over time, but we still have one question online. So Catherine Morrison, if you want to ask a quick question, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. I know you mentioned that you had some issues in getting access to this report and PCO wasn't following the Access to Information Act. I'm wondering if you can share more about that, please.
Sure. Thank you for the question. When we filed this Access to Information request in March, we did receive a request from the Privy Council office to extend by 30 days that request in accordance with the Access to Information Act. And when that deadline passed, PCO did not provide in May, they did not provide the report when it was due by the legislative requirements. So we consider that to not be following the Act. They did not seek any further extensions. They simply chose not to abide by the requirements of the Act to provide that information within the stipulated time. We received the documentation about a month outside of that period. And that is very concerning, that the Privy Council office, the highest office in the federal public service, could just disregard the Access to Information Act.
Catherine, quick follow-up.
Yeah, thank you. I know that we've spoken about how there is a lack of data in general, but I'm wondering if you have any idea of, how many employees at the PCO or otherwise have chosen to leave the public service because of issues with violence and discrimination.
And that's one of the things that the report spoke about, that for marginalized employees, the turnover was very high, that you wouldn't stay at the Privy Council office very long. Once you start experiencing this, the lifespan of a racialized person or Indigenous person at the Privy Council office was not very long. So predominantly, you'd have largely white employees remaining there for much longer periods because they are clustered in permanent high-level positions. So it has been very challenging for Black and racialized and Indigenous folks to advance at the Privy Council office. So yes, the turnover the report speaks to does indicate that that they leave quite often.
Thank you.
And sure, and just one final remark to the employees of the Privy Council office and those throughout the federal public service who continue to experience discrimination. The coalition, we want to let you know that we hear you, we see you, we love you, and we're going to continue to relentlessly pursue justice on your behalf. Thank you very much.
Here, buddy.
Yes, absolutely.